organization called Nesby Jr. in Columbus in 2016?
Yeah, 2016.
So it's just wild that we both ended up in DC, and now we're here talking about his first ever book, which is so exciting. And
yeah,
I'm incredibly proud to be here with you. There's so many questions I have about this book.
Yeah.
And it's in many ways, it's more than just a book or a recounting of a story. But
Facts.
I want to start with a pretty basic question, which is why this book now?
I mean, the kind of true answer of that is I was here at Howard, and my transition wasn't as seamless. Mm-hmm. So like most artists, you need something to kind of keep you grounded. If you're an artist in any capacity, art is what keeps you level. And at the time, I knew I needed to write, but rather than being in a space of just writing blind stories, I wanted to actually go ahead and embark upon a story. So I came across a manuscript that was doing like a week, and I needed a story to write about. And this story, since it's so personal to me, and it's based off my family, based off my life, this was the story I knew that I can tell in poem. So I just started there. And once I finished the manuscript, I was like, wow, this is actually good. And this also has helped me. You know what I mean? Like actually embarking upon writing about this story has helped me understand how I feel emotionally about the idea, about things that I've been through. And there actually is a story that I want to tell for my actual niece to read when she gets older, so that's kind of how it started. It was really the need to write art. And then I realized there's a bigger need than just the art, a story personally for me, but a story also that so many people can actually benefit from, so that's kind of the inspiration. Nothing grandiose, very just personal.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. This book very much feels like it's in the tradition of Ta-Nehisi Coates and James Baldwin, when James Baldwin wrote the letter to his nephew, and Notes of a Native Son, and Between the World and Me with Ta-Nehisi, or Ta-Nehisi. It feels very much like an open letter. It feels very much like a story to introduce someone to a world which they may or may not have an understanding of, but is nevertheless important for their survival to have an understanding of.
Facts.
And so it's in that sense that it's more than a book of poetry. In my view, or my take from it, was that it's more of a philosophical exercise in meaning making about the worlds that we live in, and trying to reconcile with and through some of the contradictions that happen in these worlds.
You hit the nail on the head, man.
Yeah.
And you make it sound good.
Well, that's part of what we're here to do. But one of those philosophical questions, when I read, I tried to understand sort of what are the questions he's asking here, beneath the surface of the processing of sort of the grief and the anxiety that comes from a family being broken apart. And one of the main threads that I saw that resonated with me kind of has this parallel in the conception of time that is prevalent with the Malagasy people. And I'll tell you what I mean. So like the Malagasy people, and this is from a guy named Wayland Dahl, who did sort of like this anthropological study. They imagine the future as flowing into the back of their heads, right? Rather than being ahead of them. And it passes them from behind such that the past stretches out in front of them. It becomes constantly, and it's kind of driving past you as if you were sitting on a train backwards. And so the present is in our periphery, right? We can only see kind of what's happening at the sides, and we don't quite have the ability to understand it. But with the past, it's in front of their eyes. It's visual, it's visible, it's known, and it's influential, and they can look at it, enjoy it, learn from it, and even play from it. Some of the imagery in your book has a lot to do with tunnels, moving through tunnels. Mm-hmm. Light obscuring or being obscured through these different changes that are happening. And it feels like this book is an exercise in contending with the past as it is right in front of you while you're moving towards this uncertain future. What have you learned about mourning or processing grief as sort of this ambiguous process of trying to move through the future? And has it changed the way that you interact with the world?
Once again, this book is a story about an uncle who is writing this entire poetry book to his niece because his brother lost custody of his daughter, and that fractured their family. Not only witnessing his brother undergo an illness simultaneously, the family not being able to see their niece. And that's the important kind of structure of this story. There's a quote I got from a movie that said, if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to abuse one. And in this story, you have two families kind of in the background. You have the family of the uncle and you have the family of the other side of the family, right? And you have this family trying to connect with their daughter, and you have this family that's keeping the family away from that. And the daughter's suffering in this. But what's more important, and what I think makes the theme hit so hard, is that it's not just a father. You're seeing that extended family is also hurting from the decisions of a mother and from the decisions of an entire family, because it can't just be a mother that enables certain behaviors. There has to be multiple people. There has to be communities that build cultures of trauma. So with that being said, as far as grieving, the uncle is grieving multiple things, and it's not just mortality, it's time, and I make time a character in this. Like, time is something that you battle with. It's something that's in front of you, and it's something that you're trying to get past. There's a poem titled A Hare's Redemption Arc, where I write the poem where the uncle symbolizes a rabbit, just as the niece symbolizes a rabbit. But in this moment, he's not just a bunny rabbit that's running away from prey. The difference between a hare and a rabbit is a hare is bigger. A hare has matured. And now he's willing to undergo this quest with his niece to where it's like, okay, we've lost this amount of time, but let's try to learn how to love each other within this framework that we now have to live in. But what you see in this poem is it's difficult. You have a little girl who in this chapter is 5, and there's little hints in the book that'll give you the age, who's in chapter 4. Chapter 4, she's 7 now. So you have this little girl who has to conceptualize this, because it's not just the uncle who's trying to force the amount of time we've missed into 2 days. She's also staying up all night because she knows Sunday I have to go. She knows, okay, I get here Friday. Like, a kid can conceptualize a schedule, so how does that emotionally weigh down on a little girl? She's having to process this, and her processing it is just like an adult. It's a rush, right? So as far as grief goes, he's grieving this time. And I think one of the things that you have to learn in this book, and something that I learned as a person, is to make peace with the past. That's the biggest, I think, theme of this story, is that amidst the trauma, our lives are still beautiful. There's a haiku that I wrote that says, and someone said dead roses weren't pretty, told me I wasn't beautiful. And that pretty much means that even in the midst of the things we've lost, even in the midst of the death, who's to say that my life still isn't worthy? Who's to say that we still can't make something out of this tragedy that we've survived? Like, we're survivors of something, right? So as far as grief goes, it's really a story of acceptance, a story of healing, and getting past the anger phase of grief. And I think that's very important culturally, because this is a story of a Black family. And culturally, the way things have happened in America to where we mourn communally over certain things that occur traumatically, consistently over time, we often get stuck in the anger phase of grief. And that often is what a protest looks like. The stuck in the anger phase, because nobody can coach what we're having to process, right? And in this book, the uncle is stuck in this anger phase. But to really find peace with yourself, to really not become harmful to the people around you, to really not become harmful to his niece, it's like, I can't internalize this anger. It's a cage. I have to get out. So that's really one thing that I've learned as far as grieving, is truly letting myself feel. So that was a bit of a one-day answer, but it was a load of questions. Yeah,
so,
you know what I mean?
Lots to touch on there. one of the other things that's interesting that I think you're writing out as a lesson in this book is that even those things which we have been taught are good and useful for getting through moments like these, such as faith, is one of the major themes, aren't necessarily the most pragmatic or useful ways to process these griefs. So you talk about, or rather, the characters go through this crisis of faith, I'll say, in a way that's very reminiscent of sort of the fall from grace that's central to the establishment of like the Christian creation narrative. You know, there are images, both real and yearned for, that the characters experience that are very reminiscent of like the Garden of Eden and sort of this perfect state of being, either in family or in the biblical example with God. And then there are these things are destroyed or made inaccessible because of choices that members of the family have made.
The garden's destroyed.
The garden's destroyed, particularly because of like the transgression of a mother, right, in this sense, which is maybe comparable or comparable to Eve eating the apple, or the niece's mom gaining custody. Was that allegory intentional, and is that how you came? Is that in any way related to how you came to view this, or this became related with the crisis of faith, or is that just sort of...
No, it would have been nice if that was, because Genesis is like very important. So I use a lot of biblical text as symbolism, and I don't just rely on Christian doctrine for my spiritual symbolism, but it's heavy. And Genesis is the most important biblical text that I reference because of how I use storms to illustrate trauma. You know what I'm saying? So one of the storms, the flood, the ark, Genesis, starting over, how I am telling a story of a family that is not going through a new storm. I mean, it's a new storm, but they've been through storms before. And what makes this storm so painful is the feeling of betrayal from God, this rage towards God that's now internalized. The last poem in chapter 1 that sets the tone for the book, the last line is, maybe God destroyed us, and it's starting to, as somebody that grew up in a faithful family, it's starting to actualize, like, maybe God isn't there for us because things like this aren't supposed to be happening. And the reader has to go on this journey with the uncle to find faith again. But as you mentioned, faith in God and faith in his relationship with his niece both parallel each other. They both kind of feed off of each other. And what he has to do is kind of understand how they correlate, but make a separation, because his niece is not his faith in God. She's a human being, just as much as his spirituality is not a system that's based on, if I pray for this, it's no more storms. I think that's something that you learn in the book. The uncle isn't asking that what acceptance looks like is not accepting bad behavior. It's learning how storms are actually necessary when it comes to laws of nature. If you pray for storms not to exist, there becomes an imbalance in the world that disrupts the way we operate. Yeah, rain doesn't always feel good when you didn't prepare for it, but next time have an umbrella. That's kind of what the story is telling in relation to using Genesis, the ark, and the flood. It's really this rebirth, not giving the storm power over me, giving me power over the storm, to where even though this happened to me, even though this happened to the uncle, it's, hey, this is what we're going to do with this, because there's no way that we're going to allow the niece to just suffer. There's no way we're going to allow her to be drowned by the storm. In the midst of this, we have to find strength. I think we can learn how to best draw strength from the story in this book. If that kind of hits the nail on the head.
That makes a lot of sense. I spend a lot of time reading nonfiction works, or like literary nonfiction works, because it's so easy to see what sort of the argument is in the book or the essay or whatever, and what the person is trying to get you to take away.
Mm-hmm.
But those lessons aren't always as impactful or as long-lasting as those that I find in fiction, which is why fiction is incredibly important for teaching us things about the world and about how we should conduct ourselves in the world. And so as I was reading this, I was trying to understand, well, what are the things that I could take to someone who doesn't read poetry, who doesn't really like to read fiction a lot, and say, no, this is important to read because you will gain sort of an understanding of these things.
Mm-hmm.
One of those things is, as we've talked about, moving through a crisis of faith and what it means to realize that, faith is not as pragmatic a solution to answering some of these pressing problems in our world, or maybe it is, but how do we work through those questions? Another one is realizing that what you think is a crisis isn't actually a crisis, but just a new condition that you have to adapt to. And so immediately what I thought of then was climate change, and the ways that our world is becoming increasingly uninhabitable or increasingly different from what we imagined we should be able to do as humans on a planet, right? It's just too hot, there's not enough water, etc. So it brought me back to connect to another sort of philosophical interrogation that I saw happening, this idea of solastalgia, which is defined as sort of the homesickness you feel when you are still at home, and your home environment is changing in ways that you find distressing, right? So what I'm getting from what you're talking about in this book is that it is possible to continue to move forward, and that, to have a rigorous and honest conversation with yourself about what exactly is happening to the best extent that you can understand it is important to be able to move through. But I'm curious if there are other sort of general lessons that you would say someone would gain from reading this book, and understanding the journeys that the characters are going through.
I think before I get to the most important one and just emphasize it again, has anyone ever been through something or a multitude of things to where you feel like the universe is out to get you? You know what I mean? Like, this again, something happens like, oh, this again, or something else. I think this book helps you navigate that and let that idea go a little bit, because one of the things that I take away from this book is when things happen to me in life, I don't look to blame something now, because as honest as this book is, I think it's so beautiful that I chose to approach it from the standpoint that I did fictionally, because in the initial chapter, the uncle is 15, and that's illustrated in a haiku. The uncle is 15, and you're seeing a psychological exposition of where his mind is at when he's witnessing his niece's birth, and he's flawed. And yeah, obviously, like, he's flawed seems maybe extreme, like something that you would say to an adult, but like, no, he's actually a flawed child. He has flawed ideas because he's setting the foundation, he's setting the unhealthy foundation of a belief system, which is that faith is a requisition system. I ask and I receive. It's just that simple. And when it goes wrong, when it doesn't look like that, it's brittle, it crumbles, And I think like I said, this book, you're no longer looking at patterns that happen to you. You're understanding that things happen. That's not an excuse for bad behavior. That's not an excuse for somebody that chooses to abuse. That's saying that this is an unfortunate part of our reality. There are things that are natural and unfortunate parts of our reality, but that doesn't mean life is out to get you, because the moment you feel life is out to get you, you exclude yourself from the opportunity and potential of enjoying the world or enjoying a future, So I think that's one thing that the book really will help, because that's something that everybody goes through, and it doesn't matter your economic status, it doesn't matter your background. People are going to go through that emotionally, being hit in life. You know what I mean? And how do you navigate that? How do you not take it personal? Because the moment you start looking at trauma and tragedies as a pattern, the more you can't face it, because it's this big thing that I no longer can just say, oh, this happened, how do I respond? Now I have to respond to something that happened 10 years ago, because I believe my car breaking down today relates to what happened to me 10 years ago. It's like, that sounds irrational when I put it like that, but that's how we emotionally interpret situations when we don't deal with the things that affect us, when we don't become real with ourselves, and face what's in the mirror and say, hey, this hurt, so that's one of the biggest things. And I think that all just connects to making peace with your past, but even the relevance of this, like, let's think of Black fathers in society, because even though this book doesn't focus on Black father, there's a poem in chapter 5 titled Empathy for My Brother. And in that poem, you realize that this uncle who is telling this story in a reaction to his brother, all this pain that he's went through as an uncle, it doesn't even come close to the pain a father is actually going through, not being able to see his child. Or not even not being able, being withheld from. It's not an inability. It's not like there isn't an effort. There is being withheld. So all these questions that the uncle is asking himself, all of these dark thoughts, imagine what the father is feeling in that. And there's a normality of this behavior in society. There's a culture that's traumatizing generations of young people because we're confusing the idea of motherhood with how toxic some mothers can actually be for their child, and how the idea of motherhood is affirming that behavior because we don't want to say, hey, that's wrong, or hey, even with your circumstance, this child deserves this. How can we take our ego out of this, right? So there's a social relevance to this book as well, even though that's not what makes it, great. It's a personal story, but there is like a relevance. This is happening today, and it's not just this family. There's tons of families happening, and what this book puts in context is it's not just the father suffering. It's not just the family suffering. The kid is also hurting behind this as well. So if we don't adjust our behavior, we're going to continue traumatizing children because of our ego and because of our negligence. So I think those are a few things that, a nonfiction reader is like, okay, yeah. That feels real, real enough at least.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I'm walking away from this book with kind of a renewed interest in some of the social imperatives that we have, right, to protect children, to create sustainable and nourishing communities, not only from a familial perspective, but just from a friendship perspective. What does it mean to live close to people who can help to alleviate some of those pressures that come from not having a family that's, a sitcom family that's totally functional, which I would argue doesn't really exist in the first place. But we are just about out of time for this section. But before we get to hear you read, I want to ask, what's next for you? I'm sure having finished a project like this, especially, is maybe very cathartic, maybe very, okay, I have a sense of I've dealt with this, now I can move forward and start to do some other things. And even from a writing perspective, I've completed a project, now I can go and complete more projects with a renewed understanding or new understanding of, what it means to be a working artist. So what's next?
Sequel for this book, actually, which I figured out. I thought of it one night and then something else happened and I was like, all right, I got a sequel. I got a story that isn't finished yet. And already, just trying to develop my career as a writer and a consistent writer. So I already knew that going into the summer, I'm going to be writing a manuscript, going with the next thing. But I want to go ahead and write this next book because, one, the style in which I wrote it, where I use poems to tell a story, it's not just a collection, like they layer on top of each other to tell a story. I want to see how, I'm trying to utilize my 20s to be as daring as possible, especially artistically. So how can I recycle this style of writing that I've tapped into and make it better? You know, how can I add more characters in the next book? And I think there's a story to be told here, because the next book will be titled When You Get Lost. And this family story isn't done. There's still things to learn, and I think there's still things to tap into as far as manhood is concerned, as far as family is concerned, and facing life's challenges even when you think you got it figured out. You know, because that's a new challenge. When you get hit and you're comfortable, how do you get back up, or how do you accept that because you feel like, I've been doing everything right, I was ready for this? It's like, no. So there's another story. It's going to be titled When You Get Lost. I'm going to start it after I finish all of the marketing with this, because I am self-publishing, so it does take a lot of work. Or personally, I've chosen to make it a lot of work because it's not about the finance. I want this to reach as many people as possible because, one, I think I'm a dope writer, but also I think there's a story to be read here. And I think the book will show itself, you know. So yeah, that's what's next.
Amazing. Well, it's been a pleasure. Seriously, all these years later, we're still here doing stuff together, which is fun.
It's crazy, man.
Thank you all so much for listening.
Yeah.
We're having a round of applause for Gabe.
Appreciate it.